This is a continuation of The Gods of Mars by Edgar Burroughs, comprising chapters 8 through 10. Chapter 8. The Depths of Omian. Now I realized why the black pirate had kept me engrossed with his strange tale. For miles he had sensed the approach of succor, and but for that single telltale glance the battleship would have been directly above us in another moment, and the boarding party, which was doubtless even now swinging in their harness from the ship's keel, would have swarmed our deck, placing my rising hope of escape in sudden and total eclipse. I was too old a hand in aerial warfare to be at a loss now for the right maneuver. Simultaneously I reversed the engines and dropped the little vessel a sheer 100 feet. Above my head I could see the dangling forms of the boarding party as the battleship raced over us. Then I rose at a sharp angle, throwing my speed lever to its last notch. Like a bolt from a crossbow, my splendid craft shot its steel prow straight at the whirring propellers of the giant above us. If I could but touch them, the huge bulk would be disabled for hours and escape once more possible. At the same instant the sun shot above the horizon, disclosing 100 grim, black faces peering over the stern of the battleship upon us. At sight of us a shout of rage went up from 100 throats. Orders were shouted, but it was too late to save the giant propellers, and with a crash we rammed them. Instantly with the shock of impact I reversed my engine, but my prow was wedged in the hole it had made in the battleship's stern. Only a second I hung there before tearing away, but that second was amply long to swarm my deck with black devils. There was no fight. In the first place there was no room to fight. We were simply submerged by numbers. Then, as swords menaced me, a command from Zodar stayed the hands of his fellows. "Secure them," he said, "but do not injure them." Several of the pirates already had released Zodar. He now personally attended to my disarming and saw that I was properly bound. At least he thought that the binding was secure. It would have been had I been a Martian, but I had to smile at the puny strands that confined my wrists. When the time came I could snap them as they had been cotton string. The girl they bound also, and then they fastened us together. In the meantime they had brought our craft alongside the disabled battleship, and soon we were transported to the latter's deck. Fully 1,000 black men manned the great engine of destruction. Her decks were crowded with them as they pressed forward as far as discipline would permit to get a glimpse of their captives. The girl's beauty elicited many brutal comments and vulgar jests. It was evident that these self-thought supermen were far inferior to the red men of Barsoom in refinement and in chivalry. My close-cropped black hair and thin complexion were the subjects of much comment. When Zodar told his fellow nobles of my fighting ability and strange origin, they crowded about me with numerous questions. The fact that I wore the harness and metal of a Tern who had been killed by a member of my party convinced them that I was an enemy of their hereditary foes, and placed me on a better footing in their estimation. Without exception the blacks were handsome men, and well-built. The officers were conspicuous through the wondrous magnificence of their resplendent trappings. Many harnesses were so encrusted with gold, platinum, silver, and precious stones as to entirely hide the leather beneath. The harness of the commanding officer was a solid mass of diamonds. Against the ebony background of his skin they blazed out with a peculiarly accentuated effulgence. The whole scene was enchanting. The handsome men, the barbaric splendor of the accoutrements, the polished skeel wood of the deck, the gloriously grained serapis of the cabins, inlaid with priceless jewels and precious metals and intricate and beautiful design, the burnished gold of handrails, the shining metal of the guns. Fader and I were taken below decks, where, still fast bound, we were thrown into a small compartment which contained a single porthole. As our escort left us, they barred the door behind them. We could hear the men working on the broken propellers, and from the porthole we could see that the vessel was drifting lazily toward the south. For some time neither of us spoke. Each was occupied with his own thoughts. For my part, one was wondering as to the fate of Tarkus and the girl, Thuvia. Even if they succeeded in eluding pursuit, they must eventually fall into the hands of either red men or green, and as fugitives from the valley door they could look for but little else than a swift and terrible death. How I wished that I might have accompanied them. It seemed to me that I could not fail to impress upon the intelligent red men of Barsoom the wicked deception that a cruel and senseless superstition had foisted upon them. Tardos Mors would believe me. Of that I was positive, and that he would have the courage of his convictions my knowledge of his character assured me. Dejah Thoris would believe me. Not a doubt as to that entered my head. Then there were 1,000 of my red and green warrior friends, whom I knew would face eternal damnation gladly for my sake. Like Tarkus, where I led they would follow. My only danger lay in that should I ever escape the black pirates it might be to fall into the hands of unfriendly red or green men. then it would mean short shrift for me. Well, there seemed little to worry about on that score, for the likelihood of my ever escaping the blacks was extremely remote. The girl and I were linked together by a rope which permitted us to move only about 3 or 4 feet from each other. When we had entered the compartment, we had seated ourselves upon a low bench beneath the porthole. The bench was the only furniture of the room. It was of sorapus wood. The floor, ceiling, and walls were of carborundum aluminum, a light, impenetrable composition extensively utilized in the construction of Martian fighting ships. As I had sat meditating upon the future, my eyes had been riveted upon the porthole, which was just level with them as I sat. Suddenly I looked toward Fedor. She was regarding me with a strange expression I had not before seen upon her face. She was very beautiful then. Instantly her white lids veiled her eyes, and I thought I discovered a delicate flush tinging her cheek. Evidently she was embarrassed at having been detected in the act of staring at a lesser creature, I thought. "Do you find the study of the lower orders interesting?" I asked, laughing. She looked up again with a nervous but relieved little laugh. "Oh, very," she said, "especially when they have such excellent profiles." It was my turn to flush, but I did not. I felt that she was poking fun at me, and I admired a brave heart that could look for humor on the road to death, and so I laughed with her. "Do you know where we are going?" she said. "To solve the mystery of the eternal hereafter, I imagine," I replied. "I am going to a worse fate than that," she said, with a little shudder. "What do you mean?" "I can only guess," she replied, "since no northern damsel of all the millions that have been stolen away by black pirates during the ages they have raided our domains has ever returned to narrate her experiences among them. That they never take a man prisoner lends strength to the belief that the fate of the girls they steal is worse than death. Is it not a just retribution?" I could not help but ask. "What do you mean?" "Do not the Therns themselves do likewise with the poor creatures who take the voluntary pilgrimage down the river of mystery? Was not Thuvia for 15 years a plaything and a slave? Is it less than just that you should suffer as you have caused others to suffer?" "You do not understand," she replied. "We Therns are a holy race. It is an honor to a lesser creature to be a slave among us. Do we not occasionally save a few of the lower orders that stupidly float down an unknown river to an unknown end? All would become the prey of the plant men and the apes. But do you not by every means encourage the superstition among those of the outside world?" I argued. "That is the wickedest of your deeds. Can you tell me why you foster the cruel deception?" "All life on Barsoom," she said, "is created solely for the support of the race of Therns. How else could we live did the outer world not furnish our labor and our food? Think you that a Thern would demean himself by labor?" "It is true then that you eat human flesh?" I asked in horror. She looked at me in pitying commiseration for my ignorance. "Truly we eat the flesh of the lower orders. Do not you also?" "The flesh of beasts, yes," I replied, "but not the flesh of man. As man may eat of the flesh of beasts, so may gods eat of the flesh of man. The holy Therns are the gods of Barsoom." I was disgusted, and I imagined that I showed it. "You are an unbeliever now," she continued gently, "but should we be fortunate enough to escape the clutches of the black pirates and come again to the court of Mate Shang, I think that we shall find an argument to convince you of the error of your ways. And," she hesitated, "perhaps we shall find a way to keep you as is one of us." Again her eyes dropped to the floor, and a faint color suffused her cheek. I could not understand her meaning, nor did I for a long time. Dea Thoris was wont to say that in some things I was a veritable simpleton, and I guessed that she was right. "I fear that I would ill requite your father's hospitality," I answered, "since the first thing that I should do were I a Thern would be to set an armed guard at the mouth of the river Is, to escort the poor deluded voyagers back to the outer world. Also should I devote my life to the extermination of the hideous plant men and their horrible companions, the great white apes." She looked at me really horror-struck. "No, no," she cried, "you must not say such terribly sacrilegious things, you must not even think them. Should they ever guess that you entertained such frightful thoughts, should we chance to regain the temples of the Therns, they would mete out a frightful death to you. Not even my," again she flushed and started over, "not even I could save you." I said no more. Evidently it was useless. She was even more steeped in superstition than the Martians of the outer world. They only worshipped a beautiful hope for a life of love and peace and happiness in the hereafter. The Therns worshipped the hideous plant men and the apes, or at least they reverenced them as the abodes of the departed spirits of their own dead. At this point the door of our prison opened to admit Shodar. He smiled pleasantly at me, and when he smiled his expression was kindly anything but cruel or vindictive. "Since you cannot escape under any circumstances," he said, I cannot see the necessity for keeping you confined below. I will cut your bonds and you may come on deck. You will witness something very interesting, and as you never shall return to the outer world, it will do no harm to permit you to see it. You will see what no other than the firstborn and their slaves know, the existence of the subterranean entrance to the Holy Land, to the real heaven of Barsoom. It will be an excellent lesson for this daughter of the Therns, he added, for she shall see the temple of Isis, and Isis, perchance, shall embrace her. Pater's head went high. What blasphemy is this, dog of a pirate? She cried. Isis would wipe out your entire breed and you ever came within sight of her temple. You have much to learn, Thern, replied Shodar, with an ugly smile, nor do I envy you the manner in which you will learn it. As we came on deck, I saw to my surprise that the vessel was passing over a great field of snow and ice. As far as the eye could reach in any direction, naught else was visible. There could be but one solution to the mystery. We were above the South Polar ice cap. Only at the poles of Mars is there ice or snow upon the planet. No sign of life appeared below us. Evidently, we were too far south even for the great fur-bearing animals which the Martians so delight in hunting. Shodar was at my side as I stood looking out over the ship's rail. What course? I asked him. A little west of south, he replied. You will see the Ots Valley directly. We shall skirt it for a few hundred miles. The Ots Valley, I exclaimed, but man, is not there where lie the domains of the Therns from which I but just escaped? Yes, answered Shodar. You crossed this ice field last night in the long chase that you led us. The Ots Valley lies in a mighty depression at the South Pole. It is sunk thousands of feet below the level of the surrounding country, like a great round bowl. 100 miles from its northern boundary rise the Ots Mountains, which circle the inner valley of Dor, in the exact center of which lies the lost Sea of Chorus. On the shore of this sea stands the golden temple of Isis in the land of the firstborn. It is there that we are bound. As I looked, I commenced to realize why it was that in all the ages only one had escaped from the valley door. My only wonder was that even the one had been successful. To cross this frozen, wind-swept waste of bleak ice alone and on foot would be impossible. Only by airboat could the journey be made, I finished aloud. It was thus that one did escape the Therns in bygone times, but none has ever escaped the firstborn, said Shodar, with a touch of pride in his voice. We had now reached the southernmost extremity of the great ice barrier. It ended abruptly in a sheer wall thousands of feet high, at the base of which stretched a level valley, broken here and there by low rolling hills and little clumps of forest, and with tiny rivers formed by the melting of the ice barrier at its base. Once we passed far above what seemed to be a deep canyon-like rift stretching from the ice wall on the north across the valley as far as the eye could reach. That is the bed of the river Is, said Shodar. It runs far beneath the ice field and below the level of the valley Ots, but its canyon is open here. Presently I described what I took to be a village, and pointing it out to Shodar, asked him what it might be. It is a village of lost souls, he answered, laughing. This strip between the ice barrier and the mountains is considered neutral ground. Some turn off from their voluntary pilgrimage down the Is, and, scaling the awful walls of its canyon below us, stop in the valley. Also a slave now and then escapes from the Therns and makes his way hither. They do not attempt to recapture such, since there is no escape from this outer valley, and as a matter of fact they fear the patrolling cruisers of the firstborn too much to venture from their own domains. The poor creatures of this outer valley are not molested by us, since they have nothing that we desire, nor are they numerically strong enough to give us an interesting fight, so we too leave them alone. There are several villages of them, but they have increased in numbers, but little in many years, since they are always warring among themselves. Now we swung a little north of west, leaving the Valley of Lost Souls, and shortly I discerned over our starboard bow what appeared to be a black mountain rising from the desolate waste of ice. It was not high and seemed to have a flat top. Shodar had left us to attend to some duty on the vessel, and Fader and I stood alone beside the rail. The girl had not once spoken since we had been brought to the deck. Is what he has been telling me true? I asked her. In part, yes, she answered. That about the outer valley is true, but what he says of the location of the temple of Isis in the center of his country is false. If it is not false, she hesitated. Oh, it cannot be true. It cannot be true. For if it were true, then for countless ages have my people gone to torture and ignominious death at the hands of their cruel enemies, instead of to the beautiful life eternal that we have been taught to believe Isis holds for us. As the lesser Barsoomians of the outer world have been lured by you to the terrible valley door, so may it be that the Therns themselves have been lured by the firstborn to an equally horrid fate, I suggested. It would be a stern and awful retribution, Fighter, but a just one. I cannot believe it, she said. We shall see, I answered. And then we fell silent again, for we were rapidly approaching the Black Mountains, which in some indefinable way seemed linked with the answer to our problem. As we neared the dark, truncated cone, the vessel's speed was diminished until we barely moved. Then we topped the crest of the mountain, and below us I saw yawning the mouth of a huge circular well, the bottom of which was lost in inky blackness. The diameter of this enormous pit was fully 1,000 feet. The walls were smooth and appeared to be composed of a black basaltic rock. For a moment the vessel hovered motionless directly above the center of the gaping void. Then slowly she began to settle into the black chasm. Lower and lower she sank until as darkness enveloped us, her lights were thrown on, and in the dim halo of her own radiance the monster battleship dropped on and on down into what seemed to me must be the very bowels of Barsoom. For quite half an hour we descended, and then the shaft terminated abruptly in the dome of a mighty subterranean world. Below us rose and fell the billows of a buried sea. A phosphorescent radiance illuminated the scene. Thousands of ships dotted the bosom of the ocean. Little islands rose here and there to support the strange and colorless vegetation of this strange world. Slowly and with majestic grace the battleship dropped until she rested on the water. Her great propellers had been drawn and housed during our descent of the shaft, and in their place had been run out the smaller but more powerful water propellers. As these commenced to revolve, the ship took up its journey once more, riding the new element as buoyantly and as safely as she had the air. Fader and I were dumbfounded. Neither had either heard or dreamed that such a world existed beneath the surface of Barsoom. Nearly all the vessels we saw were warcraft. There were a few lighters and barges, but none of the great merchantmen such as ply the upper air between the cities of the outer world. Here is the harbor of the navy of the firstborn, said a voice behind us, and turning we saw Shodar watching us with an amused smile on his lips. This sea, he continued, is larger than Chorus. It receives the waters of the lesser sea above it. To keep it from filling above a certain level, we have 4 great pumping stations that force the oversupply back into the reservoirs far north, from which the red men draw the water which irrigates their farmlands. A new light burst on me with this explanation. The red men had always considered it a miracle that caused great columns of water to spurt from the solid rock of their reservoir sides to increase the supply of the precious liquid which is so scarce in the outer world of Mars. Never had their learned men been able to fathom the secret of the source of this enormous volume of water. As ages passed, they had simply come to accept it as a matter of course and ceased to question its origin. We passed several islands on which were strangely shaped circular buildings, apparently roofless and pierced midway between the ground and their tops with small, heavily barred windows. They bore the earmarks of prisons, which were further accentuated by the armed guards who squatted on low benches without or patrolled the short beach lines. Few of these islets contained over an acre of ground, but presently we sighted a much larger one directly ahead. This proved to be our destination, and the great ship was soon made fast against the steep shore. Shodar signaled us to follow him, and with a half-dozen officers and men we left the battleship and approached a large oval structure a couple of 100 yards from the shore. "You shall soon see Isis," said Shodar to Pater. "The few prisoners we take are presented to her. Occasionally she selects slaves from among them to replenish the ranks of her handmaidens. None serves Isis above a single year." And there was a grim smile on the black's lips that lent a cruel and sinister meaning to his simple statement. Pater, though loath to believe that Isis was allied to such as these, had commenced to entertain doubts and fears. She clung very closely to me, no longer the proud daughter of the master of life and death upon Barsoom, but a young and frightened girl in the power of relentless enemies. The building which we now entered was entirely roofless. In its center was a long tank of water, set below the level of the floor like the swimming pool of a natatorium. Near one side of the pool floated an odd-looking black object. Whether it were some strange monster of these buried waters, or a queer raft, I could not at once perceive. We were soon to know, however, for as we reached the edge of the pool directly above the thing, Shodar cried out a few words in a strange tongue. Immediately a hatch cover was raised from the surface of the object, and a black seaman sprang from the bowels of the strange craft. Shodar addressed the seaman. "Transmit to your officer," he said, "the commands of Dater Shodar. Say to him that Dater Shodar, with officers and men, escorting 2 prisoners, would be transported to the gardens of Isis beside the Golden Temple." "Blessed be the shell of thy first ancestor, most noble Dater," replied the man. "It shall be done even as thou sayest," and raising both hands, palms backward, above his head after the manner of salute which is common to all races of Barsoom, he disappeared once more into the entrails of his ship. A moment later an officer resplendent in the gorgeous trappings of his rank, appeared on deck and welcomed Shodar to the vessel, and in the latter's wake we filed aboard and below. The cabin in which we found ourselves extended entirely across the ship, having portholes on either side below the waterline. No sooner were all below than a number of commands were given, in accordance with which the hatch was closed and secured, and the vessel commenced to vibrate to the rhythmic purr of its machinery. "Where can we be going in such a tiny pool of water?" asked Pedor. "Not up," I replied, for I noticed particularly that while the building is roofless, it is covered with a strong metal grating. "Then where?" she asked again. "From the appearance of the craft I judge we are going down," I replied. Pedor shuddered. For such long ages have the waters of Barsoom seas been a thing of tradition, only that even this daughter of the Therns, born as she had been within sight of Mars' only remaining sea, had the same terror of deep water as is a common attribute of all Martians. Presently the sensation of sinking became very apparent. We were going down swiftly. Now we could hear the water rushing past the portholes, and in the dim light that filtered through them to the water beyond, the swirling eddies were plainly visible. Pedor grasped my arm. "Save me," she whispered. "Save me, and your every wish shall be granted. Anything within the power of the Holy Therns to give will be yours." "Pedor," she stumbled a little here, and then in a very low voice, "Pedor already is yours." I felt very sorry for the poor child and placed my hand over hers where it rested on my arm. I presume my motive was misunderstood, for with a swift glance about the apartment to assure herself that we were alone, she threw both her arms about my neck and dragged my face down to hers. Chapter 9. Isis, goddess of life eternal. The confession of love which the girl's fright had wrung from her touched me deeply, but it humiliated me as well, since I felt that in some thoughtless word or act one had given her reason to believe that I reciprocated her affection. Never have I been much of a ladies' man, being more concerned with fighting and kindred arts which have ever seemed to me more befitting a man than mooning over a scented glove 4 sizes too small for him, or kissing a dead flower that has begun to smell like a cabbage. So I was quite at a loss as to what to do or say. 1,000 times rather face the wild hordes of the dead sea bottoms than meet the eyes of this beautiful young girl and tell her the thing that I must tell her. But there was nothing else to be done, and so I did it. Very clumsily too, I fear. Gently I unclasped her hands from about my neck, and still holding them in mine, I told her the story of my love for Dejah Thoris. That of all the women of 2 worlds that I had known and admired during my long life, she alone had I loved. The tale did not seem to please her. Like a tigress she sprang, panting, to her feet. Her beautiful face was distorted in an expression of horrible malevolence. Her eyes fairly blazed into mine. "Dog," she hissed. "Dog of a blasphemer. Think you that Phyder, daughter of Matai Shang, supplicates? She commands. What to her is your puny outer world passion for the vile creature you chose in your other life? Pedor has glorified you with her love, and you have spurned her. 10,000 unthinkably atrocious deaths could not atone for the upon that you have put upon me. The thing that you call Dejah Thoris shall die the most horrible of them all. You have sealed the warrant for her doom. And you shall be the meanest slave in the service of the goddess you have attempted to humiliate. Tortures and ignominies shall be heaped upon you until you grovel at my feet, asking the boon of death. In my gracious generosity I shall at length grant your prayer, and from the high balcony of the golden cliffs I shall watch the great white apes tear you asunder." She had it all fixed up, the whole lovely program from start to finish. It amazed me to think that one so divinely beautiful could at the same time be so fiendishly vindictive. It occurred to me, however, that she had overlooked one little factor in her revenge, and so, without any intent to add to her discomfiture, but rather to permit her to rearrange her plans along more practical lines, I pointed to the nearest porthole. Evidently she had entirely forgotten her surroundings and her present circumstances, for a single glance at the dark, swirling waters without sent her crumpled upon a low bench, where with her face buried in her arms she sobbed more like a very unhappy little girl than a proud and all-powerful goddess. Down, down we continued to sink until the heavy glass of the portholes became noticeably warm from the heat of the water without. Evidently we were very far beneath the surface crust of Mars. Presently our downward motion ceased, and I could hear the propellers swirling through the water at our stern and forcing us ahead at high speed. It was very dark down there, but the light from our portholes and the reflection from what must have been a powerful searchlight on the submarine's nose showed that we were forging through a narrow passage rock-lined and tube-like. After a few minutes the propellers ceased their whirring. We came to a full stop, and then commenced to rise swiftly toward the surface. Soon the light from without increased and we came to a stop. Shodar entered the cabin with his men. "Come," he said, and we followed him through the hatchway which had been opened by one of the seamen. We found ourselves in a small subterranean vault, in the center of which was the pool in which lay our submarine, floating as we had first seen her, with only her black back showing. Around the edge of the pool was a level platform, and then the walls of the cave rose perpendicularly for a few feet to arch toward the center of the low roof. The walls about the ledge were pierced with a number of entrances to dimly lighted passageways. Toward one of these our captors led us, and after a short walk halted before a steel cage which lay at the bottom of a shaft rising above us as far as one could see. The cage proved to be one of the common types of elevator cars that I had seen in other parts of Barsoom. They are operated by means of enormous magnets which are suspended at the top of the shaft. By an electrical device, the volume of magnetism generated is regulated and the speed of the car varied. In long stretches they move at a sickening speed, especially on the upward trip, since the small force of gravity inherent to Mars results in very little opposition to the powerful force above. Scarcely had the door of the car closed behind us than we were slowing up to stop at the landing above, so rapid was our ascent of the long shaft. When we emerged from the little building which houses the upper terminus of the elevator, we found ourselves in the midst of a veritable fairyland of beauty. The combined languages of Earthmen hold no words to convey to the mind the gorgeous beauties of the scene. One may speak of scarlet sward and ivory-stemmed trees decked with brilliant purple blooms, of winding walks paved with crushed rubies, with emerald, with turquoise, even with diamonds themselves, of a magnificent temple of burnished gold, hand-wrought with marvelous designs. But where are the words to describe the glorious colors that are unknown to earthly eyes? Where the mind or the imagination that can grasp the gorgeous scintillations of unheard-of rays as they emanate from the thousand nameless jewels of Barsoom? Even my eyes, for long years accustomed to the barbaric splendors of a Martian Jedak's court, were amazed at the glory of the scene. Pater's eyes were wide in amazement. "The Temple of Isis," she whispered, half to herself. Shodar watched us with his grim smile, partly of amusement and partly malicious gloating. The garden swarmed with brilliantly trapped black men and women. Among them moved red and white females serving their every want. The places of the outer world and the temples of the Thurns had been robbed of their princesses and goddesses that the blacks might have their slaves. Through this scene we moved toward the temple. At the main entrance we were halted by a cordon of armed guards. Shodar spoke a few words to an officer who came forward to question us. Together they entered the temple, where they remained for some time. When they returned, it was to announce that Isis desired to look upon the daughter of Matai Shang, and the strange creature from another world who had been a prince of helium. Slowly we moved through endless corridors of unthinkable beauty, through magnificent apartments and noble halls. At length we were halted in a spacious chamber in the center of the temple. One of the officers who had accompanied us advanced to a large door in the further end of the chamber. Here he must have made some sort of signal, for immediately the door opened and another richly trapped courtier emerged. We were then led up to the door, where we were directed to get down on our hands and knees with our backs toward the room we were to enter. The doors were swung open, and after being cautioned not to turn our heads under penalty of instant death, we were commanded to back into the presence of Isis. Never have I been in so humiliating a position in my life, and only my love for Deja Thoris, and the hope which still clung to me that I might again see her, kept me from rising to face the goddess of the firstborn, and go down to my death like a gentleman, facing my foes and with their blood mingling with mine. After we had crawled in this disgusting fashion for a matter of a couple of 100 feet, we were halted by our escort. "Let them rise," said a voice behind us, a thin, wavering voice, yet one that had evidently been accustomed to command for many years. "Rise," said our escort, "but do not face toward Isis." "The woman pleases me," said the thin, wavering voice again after a few moments of silence. "She shall serve me the allotted time. The man you may return to the Isle of Shador, which lies against the northern shore of the Sea of Omin. Let the woman turn and look upon Isis, knowing that those of the lower orders who gaze upon the holy vision of her radiant face survive the blinding glory but a single year." I watched Pater from the corner of my eye. She paled to a ghastly hue. Slowly, very slowly she turned, as though drawn by some invisible yet irresistible force. She was standing quite close to me, so close that her bare arm touched mine as she finally faced Isis, goddess of life eternal. I could not see the girl's face as her eyes rested for the first time on the supreme deity of Mars, but felt the shudder that ran through her in the trembling flesh of the arm that touched mine. It must be dazzling loveliness indeed, thought I, to cause such emotion in the breast of so radiant a beauty as Pador, daughter of Matai Shang. Let the woman remain. Remove the man. Go, Thus spoke Isis, and the heavy hand of the officer fell upon my shoulder. In accordance with his instructions, I dropped to my hands and knees once more and crawled from the presence. It had been my first audience with deity, but I am free to confess that I was not greatly impressed other than with the ridiculous figure I cut scrambling about on my marrow bones. Once without the chamber, the doors closed behind us and I was bid to rise. Shodar joined me, and together we slowly retraced our steps toward the gardens. "You spared my life when you easily might have taken it," he said after we had proceeded some little way in silence, "and I would aid you if I might. I can help to make your life here more bearable, but your fate is inevitable. You may never hope to return to the outer world." "What will be my fate?" I asked. "That will depend largely upon Isis. So long as she does not send for you and reveal her face to you, you may live on for years in as mild a form of bondage as I can arrange for you." "Why should she send for me?" I asked. "The men of the lower orders she often uses for various purposes of amusement. Such a fighter as you, for example, would render fine sport in the monthly rites of the temple. There are men pitted against men, and against beasts for the edification of Isis and the replenishment of her larder." "She eats human flesh?" I asked. Not in horror, however, for since my recently acquired knowledge of the Holy Therns, I was prepared for anything in this still less accessible heaven, where all was evidently dictated by a single omnipotence, where ages of narrow fanaticism and self-worship had eradicated all the broader humanitarian instincts that the race might once have possessed. They were a people drunk with power and success, looking upon the other inhabitants of Mars as we look upon the beasts of the field and the forest. Why then should they not eat of the flesh of the lower orders, whose lives and characters they no more understood than do we the inmost thoughts and sensibilities of the cattle we slaughter for our earthly tables? She eats only the flesh of the best bred of the Holy Therns and the red Barsumians. The flesh of the others goes to our boards. The animals are eaten by the slaves. She also eats other dainties." I did not understand then that there lay any special significance in his reference to other dainties. I thought the limit of ghoulishness already had been reached in the recitation of Issa's menu. I still had much to learn as to the depths of cruelty and bestiality to which omnipotence may drag its possessor. We had about reached the last of the many chambers and corridors which led to the gardens when an officer overtook us. "Isis would look again upon this man," he said. "The girl has told her that he is of wondrous beauty and of such prowess that alone he slew 7 of the firstborn, and with his bare hands took Shodar captive, binding him with his own harness." Shodar looked uncomfortable. Evidently he did not relish the thought that Isis had learned of his inglorious defeat. Without a word he turned, and we followed the officer once again to the closed doors before the audience chamber of Isis, goddess of life eternal. Here the ceremony of entrance was repeated. Again Isis bid me rise. For several minutes all was silent as the tomb. The eyes of deity were appraising me. Presently the thin, wavering voice broke the stillness, repeating in a sing-song drone the words which for countless ages had sealed the doom of numberless victims. "Let the man turn and look upon Isis, knowing that those of the lower orders who gaze upon the holy vision of her radiant face survive the blinding glory but a single year." I turned as I had been bid, expecting such a treat as only the revealment of divine glory to mortal eyes might produce. What I saw was a solid phalanx of armed men between myself and a dais supporting a great bench of carved serapis wood. On this bench, or throne, squatted a female black. She was evidently very old. Not a hair remained upon her wrinkled skull. With the exception of 2 yellow fangs, she was entirely toothless. On either side of her thin, hawk-like nose her eyes burned from the depths of horribly sunken sockets. The skin of her face was seamed and creased with 1,000,000 deep furrows. Her body was as wrinkled as her face, and as repulsive. Emaciated arms and legs attached to a torso which seemed to be mostly distorted abdomen completed the holy vision of her radiant beauty. Surrounding her were a number of female slaves, among them Phaedor, white and trembling. "This is the man who slew 7 of the firstborn and bare-handed bound Dater Shodar with his own harness?" asked Isis. "Most glorious vision of divine loveliness, it is," replied the officer who stood at my side. "Produce Dater Shodar," she commanded. Shodar was brought from the adjoining room. Isis glared at him, a baleful light in her hideous eyes. "And such as you are a dater of the firstborn," she squealed. "For the disgrace you have brought upon the immortal race you shall be degraded to a rank below the lowest. No longer be you a dater, but for evermore a slave of slaves, to fetch and carry for the lower orders that serve in the gardens of Isis. Remove his harness." Cowards and slaves wear no trappings. Shodar stood stiffly erect. Not a muscle twitched, nor a tremor shook his giant frame as a soldier of the guard roughly stripped his gorgeous trappings from him. "Be gone," screamed the infuriated little old woman. "Be gone, but instead of the light of the gardens of Isis, let you serve as a slave of this slave who conquered you in the prison on the Isle of Shador in the Sea of Omian. Take him away out of the sight of my divine eyes." Slowly and with high-held head, the proud Shodar turned and stalked from the chamber. Isis rose and turned to leave the room by another exit. Turning to me, she said, "You shall be returned to Shador for the present. Later Isis will see the manner of your fighting. Go." Then she disappeared, followed by her retinue. Only Fader lagged behind, and as I started to follow my guard toward the gardens, the girl came running after me. "Oh, do not leave me in this terrible place," she begged. "Forgive the things I said to you, my prince. I did not mean them. Only take me away with you. Let me share your imprisonment on Shador." Her words were an almost incoherent volley of thoughts. So rapidly she spoke. "You did not understand the honor that I did you. Among the Therns there is no marriage or giving in marriage, as among the lower orders of the outer world. We might have lived together forever in love and happiness. We have both looked upon Isis, and in a year we die. Let us live that year at least together in what measure of joy remains for the doomed." "If it was difficult for me to understand you, Pater," I replied, "can you not understand that possibly it is equally difficult for you to understand the motives, the customs, and the social laws that guide me? I do not wish to hurt you, nor to seem to undervalue the honor which you have done me, but the thing you desire may not be. Regardless of the foolish belief of the peoples of the outer world or of Holy Thern, or Eben Firstborn, I am not dead. While I live, my heart beats for but one woman, the incomparable Dija Thoris, Princess of Helium. When death overtakes me, my heart shall have ceased to beat, but what comes after that I know not. And in that I am as wise as Matai Shang, master of life and death upon Barsum, or Isis, gods of life eternal." Pater stood looking at me intently for a moment. No anger showed in her eyes this time, only a pathetic expression of hopeless sorrow. "I do not understand," she said, and turning walked slowly in the direction of the door through which Isis and her retinue had passed. A moment later she had passed from my sight. Chapter 10. The Prison Isle of Shador. In the outer gardens to which the guard now escorted me, I found Shodar surrounded by a crowd of noble blacks. They were reviling and cursing him. The men slapped his face. The women spat upon him. When I appeared, they turned their attentions toward me. "Ah," cried one, "so this is the creature who overcame the great Shodar bare-handed. Let us see how it was done." "Let him bind Thurid," suggested a beautiful woman, laughing. "Thurid is a noble dater. Let Thurid show the dog what it means to face a real man." "Yes, Thurid." "Thurid," cried a dozen voices. "Here he is now," exclaimed another, and turning in the direction indicated I saw a huge black weighed down with resplendent ornaments, and arms advancing with noble and gallant bearing toward us. "What now?" he cried. "What would you of Thurid?" Quickly a dozen voices explained. Thurid turned toward Shodar, his eyes narrowing to two nasty slits. "Callet," he hissed. "Ever did I think you carried the heart of a sork in your putrid breast? Often have you bested me in the secret councils of Isis, but now in the field of war, where men are truly gauge, your scabby heart hath revealed its sores to all the world. Callet, I spurn you with my foot," and with the words he turned to kick Shodar. My blood was up. For minutes it had been boiling at the cowardly treatment they had been according this once powerful comrade because he had fallen from the favor of Isis. I had no love for Shodar, but I cannot stand the sight of cowardly injustice and persecution without seeing red as through a haze of bloody mist, and doing things on the impulse of the moment that I presume I never should do after mature deliberation. I was standing close beside Shodar as Thurid swung his foot for the cowardly kick. The degraded dater stood erect and motionless as a carven image. He was prepared to take whatever his former comrades had to offer in the way of insults and reproaches, and take them in manly silence and stoicism. But as Thurid's foot swung, so did mine, and I caught him a painful blow upon the shin bone that saved Shodar from this added ignominy. For a moment there was tense silence, then Thurid, with a roar of rage, sprang for my throat just as Zig Shodar had upon the deck of the cruiser. The results were identical. I ducked beneath his outstretched arms, and as he lunged past me, planted a terrific right on the side of his jaw. The big fellow spun around like a top, his knees gave beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground at my feet. The blacks gazed in astonishment, first at the still form of the proud dater lying there in the ruby dust of the pathway, then at me as though they could not believe that such a thing could be. "You asked me to bind Thurid," I cried, "behold." And then I stooped beside the prostrate form, tore the harness from it, and bound the fellow's arms and legs securely. "As you have done to Shodar, now do you likewise to Thurid. Take him before Isis, bound in his own harness, that she may see with her own eyes, that there be one among you now who is greater than the firstborn. Who are you? Whispered the woman who had first suggested that I attempt to bind Thurid. I am a citizen of two worlds, Captain John Carter of Virginia, Prince of the House of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. Take this man to your goddess, as I have said, and tell her too, that as I have done to Shodar and Thurid, so also can I do to the mightiest of her daters. With naked hands, with long sword or with short sword, I challenge the flower of her fighting men to combat. Come, said the officer who was guarding me back to Shidor. My orders are imperative. There is to be no delay. Shodar, come you also. There was little of disrespect in the tone that the man used in addressing either Shodar or myself. It was evident that he felt less contempt for the former dater, since he had witnessed the ease with which I disposed of the powerful Thurid. That his respect for me was greater than it should have been for a slave was quite apparent from the fact that during the balance of the return journey he walked, or stood always behind me, a drawn short sword in his hand. The return to the Sea of Omine was uneventful. We dropped down the awful shaft in the same car that had brought us to the surface. There we entered the submarine, taking the long dive to the tunnel far beneath the upper world. Then through the tunnel and up again to the pool from which we had had our first introduction to the wonderful passageway from Omine to the Temple of Isis. From the island of the submarine we were transported on a small cruiser to the distant Isle of Shidor. Here we found a small stone prison and a guard of half a dozen blacks. There was no ceremony wasted in completing our incarceration. One of the blacks opened the door of the prison with a huge key. We walked in. The door closed behind us. The lock grated, and with the sound there swept over me again that terrible feeling of hopelessness that I had felt in the Chamber of Mystery in the Golden Cliffs beneath the Gardens of the Holy Therns. Then Tars Tarkas had been with me, but now I was utterly alone in so far as friendly companionship was concerned. I fell to wondering about the fate of the great Thark, and of his beautiful companion, the girl Tuvia. Even should they by some miracle have escaped and been received and spared by a friendly nation, what hope had I of the succor which I knew they would gladly extend if it lay in their power? They could not guess my whereabouts or my fate, for none on all Barsoom even dream of such a place as this. Nor would it have advantaged me any had they known the exact location of my prison, for who could hope to penetrate to this buried sea in the face of the mighty navy of the firstborn? No, my case was hopeless. Well, I would make the best of it, and rising I swept aside the brooding despair that had been endeavoring to claim me. With the idea of exploring my prison, I started to look around. Shodar sat with bowed head upon a low stone bench near the center of the room in which we were. He had not spoken since Isis had degraded him. The building was roofless, the walls rising to a height of about 30 feet. Halfway up were a couple of small, heavily barred windows. The prison was divided into several rooms by partitions 20 feet high. There was no one in the room which we occupied, but two doors which led to other rooms were opened. I entered one of these rooms, but found it vacant. Thus I continued through several of the chambers, until in the last one I found a young red Martian boy sleeping upon the stone bench, which constituted the only furniture of any of the prison cells. Evidently he was the only other prisoner. As he slept I leaned over and looked at him. There was something strangely familiar about his face, and yet I could not place him. His features were very regular and, like the proportions of his graceful limbs and body, beautiful in the extreme. He was very light in color for a red man, but in other respects he seemed a typical specimen of this handsome race. I did not awaken him, for sleep in prison is such a priceless boon that I have seen men transformed into raging brutes when robbed by one of their fellow prisoners of a few precious moments of it. Returning to my own cell, I found Shodar still sitting in the same position in which I had left him. Man, I cried, it will profit you nothing to mope thus. It were no disgrace to be bested by John Carter. You have seen that in the ease with which I accounted for Thurid. You knew it before when on the cruiser's deck you saw me slay 3 of your comrades. I would that you had dispatched me at the same time, he said. Come, come, I cried. There is hope yet. Neither of us is dead. We are great fighters. Why not win to freedom? He looked at me in amazement. You know not of what you speak, he replied. Isis is omnipotent. Isis is omniscient. She hears now the words you speak. She knows the thoughts you think. It is sacrilege even to dream of breaking her commands. Rot, Shodar, I ejaculated impatiently. He sprang to his feet in horror. The curse of Isis will fall upon you, he cried. In another instant you will be smitten down, writhing to your death in horrible agony. Do you believe that, Shodar? I asked. Of course, who would dare doubt? I doubt, yes, and further I deny, I said. Why, Shodar, you tell me that she even knows my thoughts. The red men have all had that power for ages. And another wonderful power. They can shut their minds so that none may read their thoughts. I learned the first secret years ago, the other I never had to learn, since upon all Barsoom is none who can read what passes in the secret chambers of my brain. Your goddess cannot read my thoughts, nor can she read yours when you are out of sight, unless you will it. Had she been able to read mine, I am afraid that her pride would have suffered a rather severe shock when I turned at her command to gaze upon the holy vision of her radiant face. What do you mean? He whispered in an affrighted voice, so low that I could scarcely hear him. I mean that I thought her the most repulsive and vilely hideous creature my eyes ever had rested upon. For a moment he eyed me in horror-stricken amazement, and then with a cry of blasphemer he sprang upon me. I did not wish to strike him again, nor was it necessary, since he was unarmed and therefore quite harmless to me. As he came, I grasped his left wrist with my left hand, and swinging my right arm about his left shoulder, caught him beneath the chin with my elbow, and bore him backward across my thigh. There he hung helpless for a moment, glaring up at me in impotent rage. Shodar, I said, let us be friends. For a year, possibly we may be forced to live together in the narrow confines of this tiny room. I am sorry to have offended you, but I could not dream that one who had suffered from the cruel injustice of Isis still could believe her divine. I will say a few more words, Sodar, with no intent to wound your feelings further, but rather that you may give thought to the fact that while we live, we are still more the arbiters of our own fate than is any god. Isis, you see, has not struck me dead, nor is she rescuing her faithful Sodar from the clutches of the unbeliever who defamed her fair beauty. No, Shodar, your Isis is a mortal old woman. Once out of her clutches and she cannot harm you. With your knowledge of this strange land and my knowledge of the outer world, two such fighting men as you and I should be able to win our way to freedom. Even though we died in the attempt, would not our memories be fairer than as though we remained in servile fear to be butchered by a cruel and unjust tyrant, call her goddess or mortal, as you will. As I finished, I raised Sodar to his feet and released him. He did not renew the attack upon me, nor did he speak. Instead, he walked toward the bench, and sinking down upon it, remained lost in deep thought for hours. A long time afterward, I heard a soft sound at the doorway leading to one of the other apartments, and, looking up, beheld the red Martian youth gazing intently at us. Care, I cried, after the red Martian manner of greeting. Care, he replied. What do you hear? I await my death, I presume, I replied with a wry smile. He too smiled, a brave and winning smile. I also, he said. Mine will come soon. I looked upon the radiant beauty of Isis nearly a year since. It has always been a source of keen wonder to me that I did not drop dead at the first sight of that hideous countenance, and her belly. By my first ancestor, but never was there so grotesque a figure in all the universe. That they should call such a one goddess of life eternal, goddess of death, mother of the nearer moon, and 50 other equally impossible titles, is quite beyond me. How came you here? I asked. It is very simple. I was flying a one-man air scout far to the south when the brilliant idea occurred to me that I should like to search for the lost Sea of Chorus, which tradition places near to the South Pole. I must have inherited from my father a wild lust for adventure, as well as a hollow where my bump of reverence should be. I had reached the area of eternal ice when my poor propeller jammed, and I dropped to the ground to make repairs. Before I knew it, the air was black with flyers, and 100 of these first-born devils were leaping to the ground all about me. With drawn swords they made for me, but before I went down beneath them they had tasted of the steel of my father's sword, and I had given such an account of myself as I know would have pleased my sire had he lived to witness it. Your father is dead? I asked. He died before the shell broke to let me step out into a world that has been very good to me, but for the sorrow that I had never the honor to know my father. I have been very happy. My only sorrow now is that my mother must mourn me as she has for 10 long years mourned my father. Who was your father? I asked. He was about to reply when the outer door of our prison opened, and a burly guard entered and ordered him to his own quarters for the night, locking the door after him as he passed through into the further chamber. It is Isis' wish that you two be confined in the same room, said the guard when he had returned to our cell. This cowardly slave of a slave is to serve you well, he said to me, indicating Shodar with a wave of his hand. If he does not, you are to beat him into submission. It is Isis' wish that you heap upon him every indignity and degradation of which you can conceive. With these words he left us. Shodar still sat with his face buried in his hands. I walked to his side and placed my hand upon his shoulder. Shodar, I said, you have heard the commands of Isis, but you need not fear that I shall attempt to put them into execution. You are a brave man, Shodar. It is your own affair if you wish to be persecuted and humiliated, but were I you, I should assert my manhood and defy my enemies. I have been thinking very hard, John Carter, he said, of all the new ideas you gave me a few hours since. Little by little I have been piecing together the things that you said which sounded blasphemous to me then with the things that I have seen in my past life and dared not even think about for fear of bringing down upon me the wrath of Isis. I believe now that she is a fraud, no more divine than you or I. More I am willing to concede that the firstborn are no holier than the holy Therns, nor the holy Therns more holy than the red men. The whole fabric of our religion is based on superstitious belief in lies that have been foisted upon us for ages by those directly above us, to whose personal profit and aggrandizement it was to have us continue to believe as they wished us to believe. I am ready to cast off the ties that have bound me. I am ready to defy Isis herself, but what will it avail us? Be the firstborn gods or mortals, they are a powerful race, and we are as fast in their clutches as though we were already dead. There is no escape. I have escaped from bad plights in the past, my friend, I replied. Nor while life is in me shall I despair of escaping from the Isle of Shador and the Sea of Omin. But we cannot escape even from the four walls of our prison, urged Extodar. Test this flint-like surface, he cried, smiting the solid rock that confined us. And look upon this polished surface. None could cling to it to reach the top. I smiled. That is the least of our troubles, Sodar, I replied. I will guarantee to scale the wall and take you with me, if you will help with your knowledge of the customs here to appoint the best time for the attempt, and guide me to the shaft that lets from the dome of this abysmal sea to the light of God's pure air above. Night time is the best and offers the only slender chance we have, for then men sleep, and only a dozing watch nods in the tops of the battleships. No watch is kept upon the cruisers and smaller craft. The watchers upon the larger vessels see to all about them. It is night now. But I exclaimed, it is not dark. How can it be night then? He smiled. Ta. You forget, he said, that we are far below ground. The light of the sun never penetrates here. There are no moons and no stars reflected in the bosom of Omin. The phosphorescent light you now see pervading this great subterranean vault emanates from the rocks that form its dome. It is always thus upon Omin, just as the billows are always as you see them rolling, ever rolling over a windless sea. At the appointed hour of night upon the world above, the men whose duties hold them here sleep, but the light is ever the same. It will make escape more difficult, I said, and then I shrugged my shoulders, for what, pray, is the pleasure of doing an easy thing? Let us sleep on it tonight, said Shodar. A plan may come with our awakening. So we threw ourselves upon the hard stone floor of our prison and slept the sleep of tired men. This concludes the fourth part, of 8 total, of The Gods of Mars, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.